November 10th, 1444. The winds from the Black Sea whip cold and merciless across the open plains near the Bulgarian port of Varna. Beneath a steel-gray sky, two armies stare at each other, their banners snapping violently in the wind. To the north, a crusading host of barely 20,000 men forms its battle lines, Polish knights in gleaming mail, Hungarian infantry, hardened by years of border wars, Wallachian allies, and mercenaries from across Europe. At their head rides a boy King Władysław III of Poland and Hungary, just 20 years old, his youth hidden beneath the weight of crown and crusade. Beside him, the seasoned general John Hunyadi, the White Knight of Transylvania, his reputation forged in endless skirmishes against the Ottomans. Facing them is a tidal wave of power. More than 50,000 Ottomans spread across the plain, their crescent banners rising like a forest of blood-red silk. At their center, the Sultan Murad II himself recalled from retirement to crush this Christian gamble once and for all. Around him gather Janissaries in tall white headgear, silent and disciplined, their muskets and bows gleaming in the pale morning light. To the flanks, Sipahi cavalry sit restless upon armored horses, while Tatar auxiliaries fan out, eager to encircle and devour. It is an army built to erase kingdoms. The stakes could not be higher. Behind the Crusaders lies the heart of Europe, Hungary, Poland, and the Holy Roman lands. If they fall here, the road west lies open. Ahead, for the Ottomans, victory would secure their dominance of the Balkans, tightening the noose around Constantinople and extinguishing the last hopes of a united Christian front. For hours, the two armies stand poised, the stillness broken only by the beating of war drums and the cries of muezzins echoing over the plain. Horses snort and paw at the frozen ground. Soldiers clutch their weapons, whispering prayers into the wind. Above, crows circle their shadows, darting like omens across the earth. The air feels heavy charged, as though the world itself is holding its breath, and then the silence shatters. Ottoman cannon thunder, their smoke rolling across the battlefield like storm clouds. Trumpets blare in reply from the Crusader lines, steel flashing as knights lower their lances. The ground begins to tremble beneath thousands of marching feet. The last crusade of medieval Europe has begun, but no one on this field knows what is about to unfold. They do not know that before the sun sets, this plain will be littered with bodies, that a king will fall in the mud, and that the dream of halting the Ottoman tide will be drowned in blood at Varna. The road to Varna was not paved in glory. It was carved in desperation. For decades, the Ottoman tide had surged across the Balkans, swallowing principalities and kingdoms one by one. Serbia bent the knee, Bulgaria shattered, Byzantium reduced to a dying ember within the crumbling walls of Constantinople. By the early 1440s, Hungary and Poland stood as the last true bulwark of Christian Europe in the East. Pope Eugenius IV, alarmed by the speed of Ottoman expansion, issued a call for crusade. His words thundered across Europe, promising forgiveness of sins, eternal salvation, and papal gold to any who would march against the Crescent. It was a desperate appeal to rekindle the fire of Christendom, long dimmed since the glory days of Jerusalem. But Europe was weary, fractured, and cynical. Few answered, yet in the courts of Krakow and Buda, the dream found champions. Władysław III, the boy king of Poland and Hungary, had barely seen 20 summers. His youth shone with zeal, but beneath the crown lay inexperience. Still, he was eager for glory, eager to be remembered as a new Richard the Lionheart. At his side stood John Hunyadi Voivode of Transylvania, a man forged in blood and smoke. Hardened by endless frontier wars, Hunyadi had earned the name the White Knight of Christendom. His tactical brilliance and relentless energy had already dealt humiliations to the Ottomans in earlier campaigns. If Władysław was the symbol, Hunyadi was the sword. The crusader host they gathered was both noble and fragile. Some 20,000, 25,000 men, Polish knights, Hungarian infantry, Wallachian auxiliaries under Prince Vlad Dracul, and mercenaries from Italy, France, and the Balkans. Against them, the Ottoman Sultan Murad II could muster at least 50,000 Janissaries, Sipahi heavy cavalry, Anatolian levies, and swarms of Tatar horse archers. It was a contest between steel and numbers, faith and empire, but the path to Varna was treacherous long before the armies clashed. The Crusaders had been promised Venetian naval support to cut Ottoman reinforcements across the Bosporus. Yet the Venetians, ever pragmatic, faltered. Murad II, who had briefly abdicated in favor of his son, returned to command his armies in person. The Christian gamble was collapsing even before the first arrow flew. Still, they marched. For to turn back would be to admit weakness, to surrender Hungary, and perhaps all Europe to the Ottomans. The die was cast, and it would be cast in blood. The armies now faced each other at Varna, on the edge of the Black Sea. It was here in this cold November dawn that all the hopes of a crusade and the fate of a young king would be tested. By early November 1444, the storm clouds gathered over the plains of Varna. Neither side would retreat. Every hour was now spent in sharpening steel, marshalling men, and shaping plans that might decide the fate of Europe. For the Crusaders, the challenge was daunting. Their army, 20,000 strong at best, would face nearly twice that number. But John Hunyadi, seasoned by a lifetime of frontier wars, believed he could outwit the Ottoman behemoth. He proposed a bold deployment. The Crusader center, composed of Polish and Hungarian heavy cavalry, would smash through the enemy's heart. On the flanks, Wallachian infantry and mercenaries would hold against the Ottoman wings. His strategy relied on momentum, on the shock of knights crashing through Janissary lines before the larger host could envelop them. It was audacious, perhaps reckless, but with no hope of reinforcement, it was the only chance. King Władysław III, despite his youth, lent his full voice to Hunyadi's plan. His role was symbolic but critical: to ride at the center, at the head of the heavy cavalry, embodying the spirit of Christendom. His presence would stiffen the courage of his men, even as whispers passed among them that their Venetian allies had abandoned the Bosporus blockade. They knew the full Ottoman might was free to march, and still they stood ready. Across the field, Sultan Murad II approached war with a very different mind. Though pressed into returning from his brief retirement, Murad wasted no time asserting command. His army of 50,000 stretched across the plain like a living wall. At its core, the Janissaries' elite infantry, bound by iron discipline, stood behind wagons chained together in a defensive barricade. Before them lay stakes and pits dug hastily into the earth to blunt a cavalry charge. On the Ottoman right, the Sipahi heavy cavalry waited armored horses pawing at the ground. On the left, Tatar horse archers fanned out, ready to harass and encircle. Murad's plan was simple yet deadly: absorb the Crusader charge, then let his wings sweep around and crush them from both sides. He could afford patience. Time and numbers were on his side. For days, the two armies stared at one another across the frost-bitten plain. Fires burned at night, casting a red glow on rows of armor. Priests blessed Crusaders with holy water, while muezzin's calls rose from the Ottoman lines. Between the two camps, a no-man's land stretched silent, littered with abandoned farms and churned mud. The board was set. Two visions of destiny, one fueled by faith, the other by empire, would soon collide. The dawn of November 10th, 1444, broke over the Black Sea with a red horizon. Mist hung low across the Varna plain, masking the movement of tens of thousands of men. But as the sun rose, banners pierced the haze, crosses on one side, crescents on the other. The silence of waiting ended. The siege of destiny had begun. The Crusaders moved first. John Hunyadi arranged his lines as planned. Wallachian infantry and mercenaries on the flanks with Polish and Hungarian heavy cavalry in the center under King Władysław himself. Priests marched before the ranks, holding aloft crucifixes, their hymns carried by the cold wind. The soldiers beat shields, shouting Deus Vult, but beneath the cries, they knew they were outnumbered 2-1. Would momentum be enough? Opposite them, the Ottomans stood immovable. Murad II, calm and deliberate, had anchored his Janissaries behind chained wagons and sharpened stakes. These elite troops, perhaps 12,000 strong, formed the immovable heart of his defense. On his right, the Sipahi cavalry shifted impatiently, while the Tatar horse archers on his left galloped in restless circles, loosing arrows that darkened the morning sky. Murad's plan was clear. Let the Crusader center dash itself against his wall, then unleash his wings to crush them. The first clash came with cavalry probing maneuvers. Tatar riders swept across the left flank, showering arrows onto Crusader lines. Mercenaries and Wallachian troops raised shields, arrows rattling like hail. On the opposite side, Hunyadi countered by sending forward light cavalry, driving the Tatars back, but not without losses. Already the field was stained with blood. Then came the testing of the Janissary barricade. Crusader knights advanced cautiously, lances lowered horses stamping in the frozen earth. As they approached, the Janissaries loosed disciplined volleys of arrows, the air filling with a deadly hiss. Men fell, horses screamed, the line pressed on. When they struck the stakes, the momentum shattered, splintered lances skittering across frozen ground. For hours, these opening exchanges raged, arrows, probes, sudden charges, repelled by the iron discipline of the Ottoman lines. Neither side gave way, yet all knew this was only the beginning. The real storm had yet to break, but in this waiting game, danger lurked. For the Crusaders, every hour spent meant more fatigue, more strain, more despair. And though the Ottomans held firm, one reckless move could still turn the tide. The field was ready. The engines of war were grinding, and both sides waited for the decisive blow that would tip balance into catastrophe or triumph. By midday, November 10th, the Battle of Varna had become a storm of blood and smoke. The opening charges had failed to break the Ottoman lines. Crusader knights lay impaled on stakes, their lances shattered, their horses writhing on frozen earth. Yet Hunyadi pressed on, desperate to pierce the Ottoman heart before the encirclement closed. For a moment it seemed possible. On the Ottoman right, the Sipahi cavalry faltered under a furious Crusader counterattack. Hunyadi's men hacked deep into their ranks, driving them back toward the hills. Shouts of triumph rose and banners waved in brief hope. But on the opposite flank, disaster unfolded. The Tatar horse archers had regrouped and now swarmed the Crusader left, showering arrows without pause. Wallachian infantry broke formation, shields splintered under relentless fire. Mercenaries who had stood firm began to retreat, muttering curses. In the chaos, gaps opened, and Ottoman horsemen surged through, cutting down stragglers. The Crusader center too was bleeding. Each charge against the Janissary barricade was met with iron disciplined spears, thrusting arrows, raining drums pounding. Corpses piled at the wagon line. The wedge formation of knights, once so proud, now fractured under its own losses. And still the Janissary wall did not move. Hunyadi galloped from flank to flank, rallying men calling for discipline. His voice cut through the din, but even he could see it. The Crusaders were tiring. Every failed charge drained their strength, while the Ottomans only grew firmer, their wings spreading wider, like the arms of a crescent closing in. And above it all, Sultan Murad II remained calm. From his command hill, he raised no frantic orders, only small signals. He knew time was his greatest ally. As long as the Janissaries held, the crusaders would grind themselves into ruin. By afternoon, the field was a nightmare. Smoke drifted across trampled farmland. The cries of the wounded mingled with the thunder of hooves. Banners once bright were now tattered, soaked in mud and blood. And still the battle raged. Then came the fatal temptation. King Władysław III, young and impetuous, saw what looked like a weakness in the Ottoman center. Behind the wagon barricade, Murad himself was visible, guarded but not unreachable. To the king, it was destiny calling strike, now slay the Sultan, and the Ottoman host would collapse. But Hunyadi had warned against reckless moves. The barricade was a trap designed to absorb such charges. Still, the king's blood was aflame. Surrounded by his royal guard, he lowered his lance and prepared to ride. The crisis of Varna had arrived. One choice, caution or glory, would decide whether Christendom stood or fell. The battlefield of Varna trembled, as if struck by thunder. What had begun as a gamble of glory had turned into a death trap. King Władysław III's fateful charge against the Janissary barricade ended in catastrophe. His horse impaled his guard, annihilated, and finally, the young monarch himself dragged down amid a storm of Ottoman steel. When his head was raised aloft on a spear, the battle's turning point had come not with a sweeping maneuver, but with the fall of a single man. For the Crusader army, the effect was instant. Shouts of "The king is dead" spread like wildfire. Where moments earlier men had fought with grim determination, now terror tore through their ranks. Standards collapsed, formations dissolved, and soldiers broke into panicked retreat. The royal banner of Poland, once a beacon, lay trampled in the mud. Hunyadi tried desperately to salvage the situation. Galloping across the field, he called for order, urging the remaining knights to hold fast, but his voice was swallowed by chaos. The mercenaries were already gone, fleeing toward the Black Sea. The Wallachian infantry, harassed relentlessly by Tatar horsemen, scattered into the countryside. Even the hardened Hungarian knights wavered, unwilling to fight without their king. Murad II, by contrast, gave no dramatic signal of triumph. From his command hill, he remained calm, watching as inevitability unfolded. The Janissaries, still unbroken, pressed forward in steady cadence. The Sipahi cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting down fugitives with merciless precision. Tatar horsemen harried the retreat, their arrows striking backs of fleeing men. The crescent had closed. By late afternoon, the plain of Varna was a slaughterhouse. Corpses choked the no-man's land before the Janissary wagons. The cries of the dying mixed with the thunder of hooves. Those who tried to reach the sea found themselves trapped by marshes and dunes, slaughtered where they stood. The Black Sea itself seemed to swallow the fleeing as men drowned in desperate attempts to escape. And so, in the span of hours, the Great Crusade collapsed. Born of papal ambition and the desperate hope of Christendom, it ended in dust and blood on a Bulgarian plain. The turning point was not merely tactical, it was existential. A single charge, a single death had broken the spine of an entire army. The banner of the crescent flew high as the sun set. For Europe, it was a night of mourning. For the Ottomans, it was a night of vindication. Varna had shown that one reckless gamble could decide the fate of empires. The field of Varna had become a graveyard. Dust and smoke hung in the cold November air, thick with the cries of the dying. And at its center, amid the roar of Janissary drums and the pounding of Sipahi hooves, a tragedy unfolded that would echo across centuries. King Władysław III, only 20 years old, charged into history. With his royal guard reduced to a handful, he drove straight into the Ottoman barricade. His horse reared impaled on hidden stakes. The king was thrown to the ground, his armor flashing briefly in the sun before it was swallowed by the swarm. He rose sword in hand, cutting down Janissaries with desperate fury. For a heartbeat, he seemed unstoppable, a beacon of courage in a collapsing world. But courage could not conquer iron walls. One by one, his guards fell, shielding him with their bodies until none remained. Surrounded, pressed by shields and spears, Władysław stood alone. Then came the fatal moment. A Janissary hook dragged him down, and spears thrust from every direction. The young king's body disappeared beneath the tide of steel. When his severed head was raised high on a spear, the battlefield erupted not in renewed battle, but in decisive collapse. The crusaders broke. Panic tore through their ranks faster than any blade. The cry, "The king is dead," struck harder than cannon fire. Men threw down weapons, trampling comrades in their flight. Standards toppled into the mud. The great crusading army, forged in the name of Christendom, dissolved into chaos. Hunyadi, the seasoned commander, fought to hold what he could. He galloped from flank to flank, urging men to stand, but despair was stronger than discipline. Mercenaries had already vanished. The Wallachians were scattered. Even Hungarian knights, hardened by years of war, turned their horses away. Alone, Hunyadi could not stop the tide. For Murad II, it was the moment of vindication. Watching from his command hill, he needed only to let the inevitable unfold. His Janissaries advanced in unbroken rhythm. His cavalry surged along the flanks, cutting fugitives down. The crescent had closed, and the cross had shattered. By sunset, Varna was silent, but for the caw of crows and the crackle of burning tents. The climax had come and passed, not with glory, but with ruin. One young king's gamble had ended in his death, and with it, the crusade itself. When the smoke cleared over the fields of Varna, silence fell upon a shattered crusade. What had begun as Christendom's boldest strike against the Ottoman Empire ended in blood and ruin. Tens of thousands of corpses lay scattered across the plain, their armor gleaming faintly in the cold November sun. The young king, once hailed as a savior, was gone, his head paraded as proof of Ottoman triumph. The immediate result was devastating. Poland and Hungary were left leaderless, their hopes crushed in a single afternoon. The Crusader coalition dissolved, its survivors limping home through mud and frost, haunted by visions of Varna's carnage. For the papacy, the dream of halting Ottoman expansion collapsed with Władysław's fall. No relief would come to Constantinople, which less than a decade later would fall to Sultan Mehmed II. For the Ottomans, Varna was vindication. Sultan Murad II had been pulled from retirement to face the Crusader threat, and now he stood triumphant. His army, disciplined and unwavering, had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. Varna confirmed the might of the Janissaries, the effectiveness of the crescent formation, and the futility of reckless crusading zeal against Ottoman patience. But the legacy of Varna was not only military, it was symbolic. For Europe, the battle was a sobering lesson. Courage without strategy, zeal without discipline leads only to ruin. For centuries, chroniclers would recall the image of Władysław's head on a spear, a grim reminder of hubris and haste. Among Hungarians and Poles, his death became both a wound and a legend. The King of Varna, remembered for his bravery, mourned for his folly. In the east, the victory reinforced Ottoman dominance. The Balkans, already trembling under their shadow, understood that no crusading host could dislodge them. The road to Constantinople and beyond lay open, and yet Varna also revealed the fragility of empires. A single decision, a single reckless charge could alter the fate of nations. Had Władysław heeded Hunyadi's counsel, the Crusaders might have lived to fight another day. Instead, Varna stood as both warning and epitaph, a graveyard where ideals clashed with reality, and where the fate of Europe tilted irrevocably toward the crescent. As night fell on November 10th, 1444. The plain of Varna belonged to the Ottomans. The trampled earth soaked in blood bore witness to the end of a crusade and the dawn of a new age. Varna was not merely a battle, it was a turning point, a marker in history's long march. And from its ashes, the world would never be the same.